Started. Good morning. Welcome. For those who don't know me, my name is Betsy Preeter. I'm PMPI's Director of Programming. We really appreciate all of you coming on out to hear about the budget process and appropriations process together and learn. For those of you who are new to PMPI, we provide professional development to folks in the federal higher education policymaking space. So we are not a think tank or an advocacy group. We are really here to teach. And so we invite our speakers to join us at events as teachers, and we invite participants like you to be here as learners and as students. So this session in particular is part of a 4-part series, as many of you are signed up for multiple parts. This is about providing that foundational understanding of the federal budget process. Part 2 is going to follow right after this at 11. We're going to try to give you a very quick break in between, but at 11, we're going to dig into the appropriations process, and then parts 3 and 4 are going to be on Thursday, and we're going to talk about budgeting for the Pell Grant, and then we're going to also have a panel on insights into the process with some former legislative and executive staff. So we are recording the first 3 sessions. So if you can't attend live, you can catch up, but we're not recording that 4th session. So if you are interested in earning the digital badge, you have to attend that one live. And we will also share copies of slides as well from our speakers. So we'll get all that to you afterwards, including the recording. Okay, so I'm going to introduce this morning's presenters, and then we're just going to get started. You will absolutely have a chance to ask questions. There is a Q&A box here on the screen. You should be able to see it, and you should be able to ask your questions at any point. We will get to them after both Nick and Robin present. But if you have a burning question, put it in there before you forget, and we will make sure to get to it during the Q&A session. So please take advantage of the Q&A box. And please, I'll actually close the chat, but please refrain from putting questions in the chat so that I can track them all and we can make sure we're answering your questions. This is clearly a very relevant time to be talking about the federal budget process. Our goal this morning is really to help you understand the process itself, or what the process is supposed to be. And then, we can talk about questions that you have about how it actually is playing out, certainly. And so we have experts to help you with that, although I can't promise that any of us are able to predict the future and know exactly what's going to happen. But we are here to get you informed as best we can. Okay, and a final reminder about that Q&A, you can upvote questions that you see that you also want answered, so feel free to do that. So I know sort of the most pressing issues that you all have, or most pressing questions, go to the top of my queue. So, all right, so with that, I'll introduce our speakers, and then we'll let them take it away. Nick Lee is joining us. Nick is a partner with Bellwether in their policy and evaluation practice. And prior to joining Bellwether, Nick held various roles in the federal government at the U.S. Department of Education and the White House Office of Management and Budget. Is particularly relevant for our conversation today, focusing on post-secondary policy issues across 3 different administrations. He also spent nearly a decade at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And joining Nick is Robin Heastand. Robin is a vice president at BOA's Public Affairs Group. Prior, Robin spent 20 years working in government and nonprofit organizations in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, at the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, the College Promise Campaign, and at Ed Trust. And most notably, in Robin's time, both the Senate and the House, but at least the Senate was on the budget committees. So again, some real world experience here to help you understand how this process looks. So Nick is going to start and do a broader overview, and Robin's going to dig a little bit more into what this means for higher ed, and how the budget process and appropriations process really drives a lot of higher ed policy. So Nick, take it away.
Good morning, folks. And I assume my slides are now on the screen right now.
They sure are.
Great. And so thanks again. Great to see so much interest in the federal budget process. It's nice to be amongst a shared group of nerds. And thanks, Betsy and folks at PMPI, for the opportunity to present a little bit about the budget process and provide an overview. Just a quick introduction for those folks who may not be familiar with Bellwether. We're a nonprofit education organization. We work across the education pipeline from early learning through workforce. And we work with folks ranging from individual schools and institutions all the way on through to state and federal governments on any challenges they might be experiencing in the course of their work in service of better education and opportunities for young people. And so what we'll do is in this overview, we'll talk about what is a 30-month process, honestly, to ideally, though usually not, getting to 12 months of actual spending. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that means here today. And I know there have obviously been a lot of what we'll call a few budget and spending related happenings over the last few weeks. And I'm sure we'll touch on some of those things today. And as Betsy laid out at the beginning, our goal really is to lay out what the process and cycle within which those things are happening, really to help put them into context. And so the best way to actually learn oftentimes about the budget process and what happens is to actually run a budget process. So let's do that here. We will notionally build the fiscal year 2026 budget. That process actually would start in May of last year and runs through September of next year. And so it's 30 months and covers 12 months of spending, which is the fiscal year 2026, which starts October 1st of this year and goes through September 30th, 2026 next year. There's 4 phases, and we'll delve a little bit more into what each of these phases are. Those are the rough amounts of time associated with each of those phases. And let's emphasize this again, right? This is how this should work on paper. Actual reality is often quite different in terms of the timing of each of these phases. And one of those reasons why that timing may not be what is on this piece of paper or on this slide is a change of administration. And so transition years tend to change this process a bit. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and what the implications of that are later. So for the purposes of this building of the fiscal year 2026 budget, let's assume this is not a transition year. Let's assume this is a regular run-of-the-mill year, okay? And so let's jump in. Before we do that, though, I do want to introduce you to some of the key players in this particular process, and that's the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office. They both offer advice and counsel, both to the political sort of folks in the executive branch and the legislative branch and the staff members that support them. They also both do cost estimation, oftentimes, and this cost estimation is important because obviously it drives the decisions for how much folks have to spend or how much folks have to save in order to meet particular targets. They all tend to use similar methodologies in doing their estimation. In fact, oftentimes when I was sitting at my OMB desk, we would talk to the CBO staff member and essentially compare notes. We use the same models oftentimes around estimating things like Pell costs or student loan costs. There's some different methodologies and there's some different assumptions, but oftentimes that is done as a team exercise really across the two parts of OMB and CBO. The one big difference to highlight here, of course, is that OMB also then has additional responsibilities around execution of the budget and working with agencies to facilitate that execution and provide oversight of those expenditures. Also, OMB often times has a lot of roles involved in coordinating different parts of the executive branch, including folks across the agencies, as well as the folks in the executive office of the president, so folks like DPC, CEA, and NEC. As part of that, having to work very closely then with the political leadership in ensuring that the OMB staff members are effectively reflecting the views of the political leadership in conjunction of their work with the agencies. And so let's jump into this process. This is this first step in the process, which, as I mentioned, in building the 2026 budget started in May. And this is the phase where the agency builds its budget. And so OMB will provide guidance to agencies in building these budgets. And that guidance is referred to as sort of as top line guidance. And it could be as basic as assume the same funding level for the entire agency that you had in your most recent fiscal year, or do that plus also give me some scenarios where you're either above by a certain percent or below by a certain percent. And then what will happen? And so when I was sitting at OPPD, which oversees the budget service within the Department of Education, they will then take that guidance and then go to the different parts of the agency and say, hey, based on this guidance, OPE, FSA, Octave, build a budget within that guidance, right, for your programs. That during this time period, those component parts of ed would then go and have their discussions with their program leads, with their political leadership, and build a proposal within that guidance. And then that proposal will get brought to sort of the Department of Education leadership. And through the series of conversations amongst career leaders and political leaders, we would then sit in those offices and actually make a recommendation to the secretary over the course of the summer. Some no doubt trade-offs are made to sort of hit those numbers. And once the decisions are made, those are then packaged together into what's then called the agency submission. And that submission is usually then sent to OMB around the middle part of September. Once that request ends up at OMB's desk, what happens is that OMB would then conduct a review. That review would include obviously looking at the numbers themselves, looking at some of the estimates used to get at those numbers. OMB would also then typically hold hearings with some of those particular parts of the department. Sometimes these proposals for spending would include new programs. So OMB staff would meet with those folks to sort of understand, like, you made a new proposal for a new $100 million program. Tell me about it. Why did you choose this new program? Why this funding level? What are some of the assumptions and reasons for proposing the new programs that we should better understand? And based on those conversations and that analysis, the OMB staff would then develop their recommendations based on that, right? To sort of say, like, well, this is what the department proposed. This is what we think about that. Those recommendations would then flow up into a pretty high stakes meeting called Director's Review. And that is a meeting usually with senior White House political leaders. You can imagine political leaders at OMB, but also parts of the executive office president that would typically also want to weigh in on education issues. And in that meeting, OMB staff members would tee up essentially some key decisions for the political leadership at the White House to make, some recommendations they might take. And after those relatively high stakes conversations, OMB staff would essentially then package those decisions around everything from the Department of Education's top line number to the disposition of certain proposals, and then pass them back in a process literally called pass back to the agency to sort of say, hey, this is sort of the White House's sort of disposition and OMB's disposition on the request that you made. Over the course of usually between November and December, those decisions would sort of get negotiated. There's a process to essentially settle on ultimately what will become the administration's budget proposal. There's an appeals process with significantly increasing levers of escalation for who actually gets to decide particular points of disagreement. Sometimes it's the OMB branch chief and the budget director. Sometimes it's like the political leadership at the Department of Ed. There will be times that certain really high profile issues will go between secretaries and principals of maybe the head of OMB. And if they can't make a decision, there's actually a review board that involves the Secretary of Treasury, the vice president, the head of OMB that actually have to arbitrate final decisions. During the 6 years I was at OMB, no decision I was ever part of got to that level, but those processes do exist if there cannot be agreement on what the administration's final proposal should be. Once those decisions are made, they then get locked into a database so that the production of the actual president's budget can be done. I don't know if folks have ever seen the president's budget, but it is like 4 or 5 volumes. It's probably like, I don't know, 4 feet tall if you stack them all up against each other. And all that takes time to produce. There's not just numbers that go in there, but there has to be the narrative to sort of justify the proposals that the administration wants to make. Also, the agency produces documents, and you'll hear a little bit about this probably from the appropriators and the appropriations process. Many binders of materials come congressional justifications, really providing further justification for the numbers that are requested, the new programs that the Department of Education and the administration are proposing. And all of that stuff that gets packaged together, published, vetted, and traditionally would go out in the form of the president's budget being released the first Tuesday in February. What that then kicks off is the third phase of the process, which is congressional action and consideration of the request that's been made by the president. The first step usually is that the Congressional Budget Office conducts an estimate, a re-estimate of this budget. I mentioned earlier that while there may be some alignment in terms of the methodologies and models that are used, at the end of the day, CBO has to produce its own estimate. So there might be new proposals in the president's budget. CBO will sort of take a look to sort of determine what they think the cost of those programs are. Similarly, around like projections around Pell, CBO really has to take its own independent look at how much they think the impacts of a particular set of proposals might be. At the same time, the appropriations committees and subcommittees start their work. This could involve everything from holding hearings with ed staff to dig into the proposals. That also involves outreach and conversation with member offices. Stakeholder groups typically would reach out to member offices and folks in the appropriations committees to sort of signal support, signal opposition, signal different points of view on some of the proposals that might be part of the president's budget. At the same time, the Budget Committee also starts laying out the blueprint for the whole potential fiscal year appropriations. So to the extent that I sort of view this as like the budget resolution is kind of like the blueprint for the House, whereas maybe like the Department of Education's budget is sort of like, hey, the living room should look specifically like this. And so obviously you need to know what the whole house looks like before you start really digging in on the components of the living room. And so at the same time that the appropriations committees are looking at the Department of Education's budgets, the budget committee is looking at the whole framework for what that fiscal year appropriations bill might look like. And then at the same time, after these hearings, right, subcommittees and full committees start introducing bills, perhaps. They get amended and reported out. Ultimately, the bills emerge from the House, which is where appropriations action has to start within Congress. They are then amended by the Senate. These differences then get reconciled in conference. Throughout this entire process, the executive branch is in close communication, obviously to sort of indicate priorities or to negotiate. And then at the end of the day, by October 1st, all 12 bills are enacted right on time, as you expect every single year in this notional process, of course. Once those bills are passed, that kicks off the fourth phase, which is really around execution of spending of those dollars that have been appropriated. There are some very formal steps that have to occur. The first is what's known as the apportionment process. This is actually the first step before any dollars can even be spent. What has to happen is that agencies actually have to submit very formal documents that OMB has to approve before dollars can be spent at all. And this approval hinges on several things. So when I was sitting at my OMB desk, I would sort of want to understand, like for this particular program, what does your spend down plan throughout the fiscal year look like, right? By midway through the fiscal year, how much will you have spent? What are some of the major expenditures that will be occurring within the course of a particular program that I needed to be aware of? That is an important formal function that OMB has to play really to kick off the actual spending of the dollars that have been appropriated. Part and parcel of that are things known as footnotes. These are essentially, I would view it as most analogous to like legislative report language. These are some potential requirements that could be attached to the formal approval of those expenditures. It could be things like, hey, as you're spending these things down by X date, I would like a report on X to know that maybe where these dollars have gone, have there been any challenges in spending those dollars? And these do have the force of law. And so we would sort of be very sparing in their use, but wanted to note that here there's some pretty formal controls and requirements associated with this expenditure of dollars. Some other things that may come up in the course of this phase of execution could be transfer authority. So the Department of Education actually has the authority in particular circumstances to sort of say, hey, we're going to take some money from one program and actually reallocate it here. This requires obviously informing Congress. The bar for doing so is high. This, I think, has historically been used, for example, to cover some of the costs of operating FSA. There were maybe insufficient funds to execute the administration of some of those programs. And so I think the Department of Education actually used its authority to move some money from some accounts to actually facilitate those processes. And so these are some other things that have come up in execution. Sometimes there are insufficient funds appropriated to cover expenditures. This occurs not just in the case of servicing and FSA, say, but sometimes around the Pell Grant program. I think that there's been some recent news, I think this week, just in terms of where there might be some shortfalls. And so in particularly extreme cases where there are insufficient dollars, the administration may make proposals to seek supplemental appropriations or emergency appropriations to cover those shortfalls. And then as you start winding down the year, wanting to ensure, obviously, that all the dollars get spent before they expire at the end of the fiscal year. And also throughout the year, really just gathering information on how certain programs are playing out to inform really the next year's process. We'll get into some of the implications of the differences between notional reality and actual reality. Here's some just numerical things that are worth highlighting for folks here. In the last 25 years of appropriations, there's been no case where all 13 bills have been passed before the end of the fiscal year. So while we've walked through what the on paper process is, the reality is that it never happens that way. There's some wide ranges in terms of when these actually happened, everything from October 21st, so just 3 weeks late, all the way on through to July 30th. So literally with 3 months remaining in the fiscal year. Sorry, August, September, October. Yes, 3 months remaining in the fiscal year was when they actually completed action on the appropriations for that fiscal year. Typically, it's somewhere around the new year. So about 1/4 of the fiscal year having been completed before final appropriations are authorized. And then since we're in a transition year, this is roughly what the timelines are in terms of when the fiscal year action is completed during a transition year. And so just for reference for folks here. What I want to do now actually is switch to so we've talked through a little bit here around on paper what the process looks like. What I actually want to show a little bit here is the difference between on paper and reality. So the slide should be coming through right now. So this column in the middle here is the 2026 budget that we're building. And we've just walked through what the notional process looks like here, right? Starting in May of 2024, all the way on through October 26. These are the phases that we talked through. This is the Department of Education coming up with this proposal. This is OMB working with White House leadership to determine what the potential proposal might be before passing it back to the Department of Education and negotiating it. That proposal then getting released. And then this green here is Congress considering the proposal, doing its bills, its hearings, and then ultimately passing a budget. And then this is the fiscal year 2026 where execution plays out. And this is the notional process. This is more actually like how it plays out, right? And so, still can follow the process of building the budget. And where the thing starts deviating is around here, right? Right now, based on my understanding, is that OMB staff are actually meeting with political leadership. I think I heard from a former colleague they're in the middle of director's review right now. So they're working internally to sort of sort out what the administration's proposal might be. And then at some point in the next few weeks, they will pass that information back to the agency. What typically happens during a transition year is around March, they would issue almost like an initial proposal, what's known as a skinny budget, right? They might lay out at a very high level what some of the top line numbers might look like. They might highlight some proposals that might emerge. And they still need 2 or 3 months to produce like what is a full traditional budget, right? And so that probably won't get released in a transition year until May. I think as folks also know, at the same time, there's several other things that are going on right now. One is there's conversations around a budget resolution, right? For talking about next year's potential reconciliation activity, which Robin's going to get into. At the same time, there is a current continuing resolution that that is not yet passed, right? So there is some chance, and I think I may have messed this up. I may need to fix this slide a little bit, but there is a current discussion for how to close out the fiscal year 2025 appropriations right now. And so that's playing out at the same time, right? While you're building next year's budget, you're having to think about what is how this year, the current fiscal year that we're in, is going to end. And so several things that are worth highlighting here, right? When you layer all three of these processes over the top of each other, you're not just building one budget at the same time. While you're planning your fiscal year 2026 budget, you're trying to figure out what you're going to do with the rest of fiscal year 2025. And you're also starting the 2027 process, right? So you have to keep a whole bunch of things in your mind at the same time. It's also conceptually hard to figure out what to ask for when you don't know how much you're going to get. So that feels like another pretty significant challenge when you're trying to build a budget. I'm going to get off this screen here, but I just wanted to visually show you what happens when you layer all these things on top of each other at the same time. The other thing that's worth raising when you don't have clarity on when you don't have clarity on what's going on and you're planning next year's budget. The other thing is when you're in a continuing resolution, which we're in right now, I think it's probably the analogy I'd like to use here is, what is it cheaper to do? Is it cheaper to pay for rent for a year or to go month to month? So right now, what's happening is agencies, the Department of Education, is trying to predict when they will have clarity on the rest of their appropriation. And so in the interim, what they're doing is they're basically going to month with these contracts. And then when they have further clarity, they will then say, okay, cool, we can lock in for the rest of the year. Same thing with grant programs, right? It's hard to know when you can actually have your grant competition if you don't have full clarity on how much money you're going to have. And so in addition to sort of not knowing how much and maybe paying more, you're also potentially smushing all the work that you need to do into like fewer and fewer months because you don't actually know how much money you have to issue in terms of your grants. And so there's some implications of the process playing out the way it does, but I wanted to highlight for you and really just make the bottom line clear, which is it's harder to make informed asks when you don't have clarity until the last minute. It's harder to make recommendations. In reality, you actually may be incurring more costs because of how the process actually plays out as you're thinking about the next fiscal year. So that I'm going to stop and hand it off to my colleague, Robin.
Thank you, Nick, so much. And in case you missed that question, everyone, I'm going to share a copy of Nick's spreadsheet too, because it is a very helpful visual. So I wanted to emphasize that. And just really quick, Robin, I know someone messaged us. I'm not sure everybody could see it. So I wanted to, one, remind everybody to put any questions into the Q&A so we see it. But then someone asked, is this process the same for the legislative and judicial branches? Robin clarified that Nick is talking about the executive branch here and how the executive branch develops and executes a budget solely. Okay, so Robin, continue on, please. Then thank you.
Yes, thank you. I am about to get into how Congress develops a budget. So let me share my screen. Okay. So my name is Robin Heestand. I'm Vice President at Bose Public Affairs. I worked on Capitol Hill for the better part of, I guess, 15 years, including about 8 years on the Senate Budget Committee, where I worked on 2 reconciliation bills. So I want to outline the congressional budget process for you with a specific focus on higher education. First, I will provide an overview of the budget process, and then towards the end, I will talk about reconciliation, which is a bit of a hot topic in the news. So as Nick outlined, there is the notional process of the budget process. There's also a notional process of the congressional budget process as well. The Congressional Budget Act was formalized in 1974, about 50 years ago, and it had sort of a linear timeline, but as the chart to the left shows, it is anything but linear. And as Nick had alluded to, But really, the congressional budget process starts in the early part of the new year. The Congressional Budget Office will release revised economics. Generally, that's not the key thing that happens, but it informs things like interest rates and how much we're going to pay on the debt. It informs student loan interest rates and what student loan costs may look like. It informs its assumptions on unemployment, just updated economics. And then what the budget process really kicks off is the first week in February. I believe it's the first Monday, when the president releases the budget. That hasn't happened on time for a variety of reasons. But after the president releases the budget, then the budget goes back to the budget committees. They review the policy and analysis in the president's budget. They review what is called baseline. Baseline is what is current law as we are today on February 11th. What are the current laws on spending? What is the current law on revenues? That is baseline. Budget committees will draft a budget resolution or a framework or not, depending, and then pass it through both the chambers, both the committee level as well as the House floor and the Senate floor, and have a conference budget resolution. After that point, hopefully that wraps up by mid-April. Appropriations moves forward with their hearings. Into the summer, they will start marking up their bills and moving it through either side of the House and the Senate. And in theory, it's all wrapped up by the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th. And there's a new fiscal year on October 1. At the end of the calendar year, that's when a lot of action needs to happen with regard to tax provisions. That's the end of the calendar year affects revenues. At a very high level, I want to sort of outline the congressional budget process. So the budget committees are going to be looking at the amount of revenue coming in and the amount of spending or outlays going out. And the difference between those two is what is your deficit number. So it's roughly 1.9 trillion. They will review those numbers. They will review estimates in the president's budget. What is the president proposing to change? And they will draft an internal blueprint. It is not signed into law by the president. It is internal. It is an internal organizing document or framework. One of the big things that happens in the budget resolution is what is called a 302A allocation, which is given to the Appropriations Committee. And then there is a reconciliation directive, which I'll get to a little bit later. I think it's helpful to outline the two different types of spending that the Budget Committee will look at. There's mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is spending that's on autopilot, and it is the jurisdiction of the authorizing committees. So that would be the Education and Workforce Committee in the House and the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Most mandatory spending is your big entitlement programs, such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, roughly 2/3 of it. But there is a piece that is related to higher education, and that is student loans, about $90 billion a year, including additional amounts for your income-driven repayment plans, public service loan forgiveness, and then a portion of Pell is also mandatory. Again, I'm not going to belabor that because there's another presenter will present on that later. There's also discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is subject to annual review by the Appropriations Committee. It is roughly $1.7, $1.8 trillion, roughly divided in half. The Pentagon receives about little less than half of that 1.7, and then the remaining amount is for all the other 11 subcommittees. So that would include Labor, Health, and Human Services, but also your commerce programs, justice programs, Head Start, any other program. There's a lot of discussion over what is the appropriate level for defense and what is the appropriate level for non-defense spending. And there's been There's been established into law, such as the Fiscal Responsibility Act, specific levels on what the defense number is going to be and what the non-defense number is going to be. Last year, the biggest non-defense subcommittee is what is called the Labor, Health and Human Services Appropriations Subcommittee. Again, defense is the largest, Labor H is the second largest, but largest within the non-defense. And that's where you have your Pell Grants, supplemental education opportunity grants, and work study programs, as well as other programs at the Department of Education. There are also tax provisions. They're about $30 billion a year, sort of an overlooked aspect of student financial aid, but they are there. And, you know, could potentially come into play if there is a reconciliation directive to the Finance Committee or House Ways and Means. So speaking of reconciliation, what is reconciliation? Reconciliation is a budget process outlined in Section 310 of the Congressional Budget Act. It is a process designed to get estimates on spending, what is put forward in that blueprint in line with reality. And to do that, elected officials have to do something that is generally considered pretty unpopular to do, such as raising taxes or cutting spending. So to do that, there's expedited processes, which are considerable value, especially in the US Senate. To get reconciliation, you have to have a reconciliation directive in either budget resolution. So, for example, the Senate budget resolution was released last Friday. There was a reconciliation directive in there to various committees, and you will see the amounts that committees had to reduce the deficit by or increase the deficit by, depending on what their policy proposal will be later. So the Senate Budget Committee is going to have to move that process through committee and onto the Senate floor, and the House will have to do something similar in order for that reconciliation directive to sort of become real from a congressional perspective. Reconciliation can cover 3 topics. It can cover taxes, it can cover spending, and it can cover the debt limit. You can combine all 3 topics into one big bill, or you can have 3 separate bills. Reconciliation is an optional process. Drafting a budget resolution is an optional process. Nothing happens if Congress doesn't do a budget resolution. It is not required by law. The reconciliation process is a very big deal in the Senate, and I have the Senate seal there because the Senate traditionally operates through unanimous consent agreements. That means you have all 100 senators agree to do something. There's also motions to proceed to a bill, which are debatable, and you need 60 votes to end debate on that. Motions to go to final passage or to vote on a bill, that is also debatable. You need 60 votes for that. Reconciliation circumvents that. You need 51 votes, and senators cannot talk for 2 weeks on a bill because there's limits on debate. There's strict time limits. You get 20 hours equally divided. In addition, in the Senate, there's an open amendment process. That's not the case with reconciliation. So for example, in the Senate, if you had the Higher Education Act on the Senate floor, you could, in theory, offer an amendment on, let's say, Indian Health Service or oil and gas drilling, because it's an open amendment process. Not the case. Amendments have to be germane to the committees that are in the reconciliation directive, and they must be budgetary in nature and adhere to the Byrd rule. After the 20 hours has expired on reconciliation, you go into what is called vote-a-rama, and vote-a-rama goes until exhaustion, and that is anything goes. There's no limits on debate. It is to exhaustion, and you get a lot of kind of nasty messaging bills that senators have to vote on. And, you know, senators need to be careful about what gets added in to reconciliation during Votorama for a variety of reasons. One is political reasons. If you're up for reelection and you're in a tough reelection, you probably don't want to take votes on some of these nasty amendments. A classic example is guns in National Park or guns on Amtrak. But the other reason too is if you have too many of these sort of toxic policy amendments, it could, the parliamentarian could rule that it no longer meets the reconciliation directive, the expedited status and process and procedures of reconciliation could fall. That has not happened, but you know, that option is there. Whenever there's talk of reconciliation, there is always talk about the Byrd Rule. I have the Byrd Rule is named after the late Robert Byrd, a senator from West Virginia, the longest serving senator. He was known to argue in favor of antiquated policies and procedures in the budget process, as well as on the Senate floor. He initially outlined these sort of 6 guidelines and then codified them into law in 1990. They are subject to interpretation by the Senate parliamentarian. The #1 violation of the Byrd Rule is that first one, that it does not produce a change in outlays or revenues, which would make it a policy provision. CRS has done some analysis saying that there's, I don't know that I have, but generally motions to waive the Byrd Rule do not pass. It is a 60 vote threshold. I believe there's only been 9 times since 1983 that we have waived the Byrd Rule. One that is of significance for taxes is changes outside the budget window. If you're familiar with the Bush tax cuts, they had a sunset after 10 years. The reason why they had a sunset after 10 years is because of the fourth one here, or I'm sorry, the fifth one. It would increase the deficit beyond the window envisioned by the budget resolution and the reconciliation directive. And Social Security obviously is off limits in reconciliation. Byrd Rule is subject to interpretation by the Senate parliamentarian. She is appointed by the majority leader of the Senate. The current individual, Elizabeth McDonough, has been in that role for, oh gosh, 12 to 15 years. So she has served under both, Republican leadership as well as Democratic leadership. She relies on estimates from the Joint Committee on Taxation and the Congressional Budget Office, as well as Senate precedent, as well as consulting the chair of the Budget Committee to make determinations of the Byrd Rule. And usually as part of the process, when reconciliation is being discussed, as a courtesy, she will do what is called a Byrd bath with relevant staff of the congressional committees writing legislation. So she will review and her staff will review proposed legislation before it has even been filed or what we call dropped in the Senate, to see what could violate the Byrd Rule. And she does this as a courtesy. So when reconciliation when it's time to hit go, hopefully all the Byrd Rule issues have been worked out. So Nick talked about this a little bit when he was talking about the notional process and when the budget could be released. This is an infographic it's on our website, sort of outlining what reconciliation in the budget process looks like in a presidential transition year. And I think the thing that I really want to drive home here is that usually it happens within weeks of the new president being inaugurated. So back in 2017, it was literally the week the new Congress was sworn in before Trump was even was even inaugurated. In 2021, reconciliation, the budget resolution happened a few weeks in early February after Biden and Harris were sworn in. The parliamentarian made a ruling in 2017 that said you can have, oh, it's a blank slide, two budget resolutions in 1 year. It used to be, they haven't, you can have two budget resolutions in 1 year. So in 2017, the prior Congress in 2016 didn't do a budget resolution. So in 2017, the new Congress had the opportunity to do that last year's budget. And so they had an opportunity to do reconciliation. And that was the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. It moved through the House fairly quickly. And that was your famous John McCain vote saying no. Once that all sort of happened, the House and Senate came back and they did a new reconciliation directive through a new budget resolution, which was the tax cuts that was enacted by the end of the calendar year in 2017. When Biden came in, they did something similar. They did two budget resolutions, and so they had two reconciliation directives within 1 calendar year. So since Congress didn't do a fiscal year 21 budget resolution, they did one, and that was the American Rescue Plan, which Nick worked on. And then they came back later and they did an updated they did a new budget resolution with a new window going from fiscal 22 to 31. And that was initially Build Back Better, which became the Inflation Reduction Act after a lot of Senate negotiation. So when there's talk about one bill or two on reconciliation, that is what they're getting at. Will they do two budget resolutions or one? So right now, the Senate budget resolution, the Senate wants to do two budget resolutions. So they'll do defense and immigration on the first budget resolution. And then they're going to come back and do a new budget resolution later in the year on taxes, where the House wants to do just one budget resolution and one big, beautiful bill to get that done. Blank slide. There's been a lot of changes to student aid through reconciliation. Cohort default rates were established in 1999 through reconciliation. Direct loans used to be a pilot program at the Department of Education when Lamar Alexander was Secretary of Education back in the early 90s. When Clinton came into office, they expanded the program. And so we would have two student lending programs. 1997, Balanced Budget Act, changes to lender fees and loan programs. 97, taxpayer relief, that's where you get a lot of your education related tax provision, such as student loan interest deduction, 529 plans. And then more recent efforts include 2005. What is in green is what we spent the money on. What's in red is what we cut. So again, there was two student loan systems. So we would go in and we would sort of hit the lenders, the bank-based student lenders, and we would put the money towards student benefits. 2007, we created the mandatory Pell add-on, as well as public service loan forgiveness. Completely did away with the bank-based student loan program in 2010. So now we only have direct lending, put a lot of that money into Pell. And then we did the rescue plan, where we provide a lot of money to governors through and institutions through, excuse me. Higher ed emergency relief. So historically, student loans have been somewhat neutral within the student loan program, but the dynamics have changed because we no longer have the bank-based student loan program. So that means like any changes to student benefits, such as increasing Pell or expanding Pell, is going to have to be paid for by cuts to student loan benefits. So with that, I'm sorry, have a bit of a frog. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Robin. I'm gonna bring Nick back here, myself back here. Appreciate it. And again, want to emphasize how important understanding reconciliation is. If you are interested in financial aid, higher education, as you can see, so much what is considered major events in higher ed happen through this process. So we have a couple of questions, and I have some too. But wanted to get back, and I'll direct this to you, Nick. Someone asked, when OMB provides top-line guidance to agencies, is that every agency everywhere in all branches, or are they just directing that towards executive branch agencies?
So usually what in the budget world, like every sort of year around that time, everyone's like, has OMB provided guidance yet? And it's usually like it's a memo that OMB will issue, and they will send to essentially all federal agencies at the agency the top of the agency level, right? The department level, and say like, hey, here's your guidance. Use this number to develop your proposal for the fiscal year. So it's the same. It's the same memo that will usually go to every agency, and it will either outline one number, or it'll say like, do a agency-wide budget with this guidance level funding. And if you want to include some additional information for how you would do a plus 5% scenario, you can include that. Now, sometimes people ignore that guidance just because they're like, no, I don't want to have a level funded. And so then they'll submit a budget that does not comport with guidance, and that causes some challenges. But usually that's how that process would unfold. So every agency gets the same memo.
And speaking of guidance too, Robin mentioned congressional action relying a lot on CBO, the Congressional Budget Office guidance. So maybe you both could address sort of if participants are hearing OMB gives guidance, but then to the agencies and they put together their budget, but then is Congress getting their guidance mostly from CBO and not OMB? Could you maybe unpack that a little bit for everybody? Why are there two different organizations giving guidance on budget matters?
So I'll start. We primarily get guidance from the Congressional Budget Office if you are a congressional staffer, but that doesn't mean that you don't interface with OMB. So specifically, like when the president releases his budget, like you will interface with staff at OMB. The reason why there is sort of two different scoring agencies stems from Congress wanted their own independent agency to do scoring after Watergate. So they established the Congressional Budget Office.
And I would say that in addition to sort of there being not just collegial relationships between OMB and CBO, but also like OMB and the agency staff would regularly talk with CBO and congressional staff, right? And so those lines of communication always exist. I will say though that the CBO estimate, however, is quite important, right? Because at the end of the day, those are the numbers that Congress, in building their legislation and sort of like ensuring that reconciliation saves money in some way, those numbers are the numbers of record, right? They actually have to hit those numbers. So even if OMB and the executive branch might come up with a different estimate, and they can argue, and sometimes there have been discussions, I think, behind the scenes of like, CBO, why did you get to that number? This time it really matters. Can you change your number? There are those moments where those discussions do happen, but then because at the end of the day, that CBO number is the number that legislation has to use. And that really matters when you're trying to hit certain targets with the math at the end of the day.
And just to put as an example for CBO had very different estimates on Pell than OMB did, because CBO looked at what was going on with FAFSA last year and assumed lower take-up rates on Pell. So that that has implications for appropriations later on.
So again, I'm thinking about there are a lot of students on this call and a lot of folks newer to the space. So I wanted to ask a question. We hear this phrase, power of the purse, that Congress has the power of the purse, right? So, when you think about the impact of the presidential budget, I mean, and then the congressional budget itself. So there are two, relatively weighty, significant products that are put out. But how realistic would you say it is that the congressional budget matches the presidential budget? Is it for show? Is it mostly optics? Is it mostly identifying priorities? Or does Congress really have the say here ultimately about what should be included in the budget?
I think this is, I think this is being litigated in real time right now.
Yes.
I would say generally Congress does its thing, like the president proposes and Congress disposes. I mean, there are lots of policy provisions that Nick, put in the president's budget back in the day, and Congress, didn't act on them. But I mean, I think, this is kind of new territory that we're in, where you have a very muscular executive branch kind of wanting to do things their way.
Yeah, and I would say that, the budget document itself is that, right? Like, and I could argue that that is also true of like bills that Congress sort of might initially draft, right? Like those are statements of priorities, right? And I think at the end of the day, right, like you ultimately need Congress to pass and the president to sign and not veto, and or at least not have a veto overturned, to have an appropriations bill or have a reconciliation bill. And so I would certainly say that the president's budget is a statement of priorities. It's the start of a negotiation. And so, yeah, there's certainly times where, whether as a civil servant or as an appointee, like we put things in the budget that didn't happen. And there are other times where that started a conversation that led to something new happening. And so I would say that, in terms of like the impact of the documents themselves, whether it's Congress's budget or budget resolution or the president's budget, I think that they, at the end of the day, are all like starting points for the real negotiation that has to happen before a bill will come to law.
Thanks. I want to move on to our appropriations process, and we're going to take a quick break and bring in our next presenters. I did know there were a couple of Pell questions. So I wanted to flag for folks, we are going to spend a whole hour talking about how Pell is budgeted, and we are really going to get into this. Why is it funded partly from the mandatory side of the budget and partly from the discretionary? So I appreciate that question. We will absolutely get to it on Thursday because it's really important, and I appreciate you asking it. But didn't want you to think I was ignoring that question. So we're going to take 2 minutes to sort of transition here, but I want to thank Robin and Nick so much for kicking us off. Thanks for being here. We will absolutely share their slides and resources. And if everybody can sit tight, we're going to get our next 2 presenters in here and then talk about the appropriations process. So thanks to both.